Good evening. Can you hear me? Is the mic on? My name is Julius Amin. I am Professor of History and Alumni Chair in the Humanities here at the University of Dayton. I welcome all of you to this event, and on behalf of our planning committee, the planning committee for the Global Voices Symposium, whose members are Dr. Chris Agnew, Dr. Amanti Roy, Mrs. Sangeeta Kosilia, and Mrs. Monica Harris. We welcome you to this event. Working on the Global Voices Symposium, as you can tell, entails collaboration across campus and across, particularly this year, across the city of Dayton. I want to take a minute or so just to extend my thanks to some people who were vital in this effort. First, I want to recognize the President of the University of Dayton, Dr. Eric Spina. Because of certain circumstances and the timing, he could not be here today. But again, as I said, I want to recognize him, whose vision that would create a university for the common good enabled us to think in bold new directions. I extend my thanks to Dr. Paul Benson, Provost of the University of Dayton, again, who because of another conflict in schedule cannot be here this evening. And also to the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, Dr. Jason Pierce, who is here. And both of them believed in us when we began this process, when we began to use the symposium to address some critical mission-driven issues. And they've always supported us. We thank you very much. My thanks go to Dr. Amy Anderson, Dr. Derek Grant, and Mrs. Merida Allen, who provided important suggestions to the planning committee when we were planning this process. My chairperson, Dr. Juan Santamarina, was always very supportive. Thank you very much. The staff at the Office of the Alumni Chair in Humanities was magnificent. Heidi Haas, the administrative assistant and student assistant, Barack Kumar Guba, they took care of all the arrangements. Emily of the Kennedy Union helped us to identify space when we began trying to reschedule. I learned very quickly that to reschedule an event can be a towering task. The staff at catering and food services ensured that everything was done right. We thank them very much. I extend my gratitude to all the presenters, students, alumni, and our colleagues from the city of Dayton. Your presentations challenge our students and all of us to develop a sense of global consciousness. It was a joy to listen to you. Finally, I want to recognize faculty, staff, students, and all present for buying into the idea that the University of Dayton and the larger Dayton community is a global space, and therefore must continue to search for ways to turn that notion into reality. Today we gather on this campus to learn and to educate each other on the importance of global awareness. All of you will agree that this is an important moment in history. Recent and repeated attacks on the diverse nature of the global community should not deter us. Rather, they should embolden our efforts to continue to create a diverse and inclusive community. By its very nature, a university campus demands that its members challenge the dictatorship of ignorance. Global and intercultural consciousness are the heart of the University of Dayton's mission. 2 years ago, in his inaugural address, UD President Rex Pina stated that intercultural excellence is a must. It was and remains a timely message and calls for a paradigm shift. People from diverse backgrounds must be respected and not just tolerated. Roughly 60 years ago, in a commencement address, President John F. Kennedy admonished students to take seriously their obligations to promote human understanding. He stated, and I quote, "Let us direct attention to our common interest. We can help make the world safe for diversity. In the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal." Unquote. Whether you come from Washington, D.C., or from Beijing, or from Accra, or from Abuja, or from Yaoundé, or Mexico City, or Riyadh, or New Delhi, and yes, or from Dayton, Ohio, we all inhabit the same earth surface. All of us must rededicate ourselves to imploding the disease of intolerance and the hate which are increasingly becoming infectious. We must celebrate the world's diverse cultures, traditions, religions, and peoples. It is the way for the future. Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce to you Dr. Amy Anderson, Associate Provost for Global and Intercultural Affairs.
Good evening, everyone. Let me also extend a warm welcome to each and every one of you. For the students, faculty, and staff, and community members who've been participating in this forum throughout the day, your words have been inspiring, as Dr. Amy mentioned. I want a special welcome to community members from Dayton and beyond who are joining us here tonight, maybe for the first time. I hope that you'll consider coming back many times to collaborate and share opportunities to learn together about important issues. Before I kind of provide some very brief contextual remarks and introduce our speaker, I do want to take a moment to thank Dr. Julius Simmons for his leadership, along with his committee, for creating these spaces to have this symposium. This is the third, maybe 3.5, since this one it's been rescheduled, so it's extra work. But just really an amazing job, and I want to give you a round of applause. Don't really need to convince you, because you're here tonight, about the importance of global learning and perspectives. But before I introduce the speaker, I did want to provide just a few contextual remarks this evening. According to UNESCO, at its core, global learning enables people to understand the links between their own lives and those of people throughout the world. It increases understanding of the economic, cultural, political, and environmental influence that shape our lives. It develops the skills, attitudes, and values which enable people to work together to bring about change and take control of their own lives. And it helps work towards achieving a more just and sustainable world in which power and resources are more equitably shared. The emphasis in global education is therefore on both changing self and changing society, for neither is possible without the other. In addition, we know through research that global learning has so many benefits that lead to human success and overall well-being. I'll just name a few short examples. Engagement. Research shows that when students, and when I say students, I'm really referring to all of us as learners. When students engage to learn content through authentic tasks and real-world experiences, they're more likely to engage, which in turn leads to higher attendance rates and achievement. Career readiness. We know that the economy is global, and employers are really seeking to hire graduates with intercultural leadership skills. So by preparing spaces for global learning, we really are setting ourselves up for full participation in the global economy. Social and emotional learning is another. It helps develop self-awareness of one's own identity, culture, beliefs, and how this connects to the wider world. It also helps us develop social awareness, empathy, and perspective taking of others. and finding relationship building so that we can work together for the common good. And lastly, I just mentioned empowerment. That global learning allows us with the agency to take purposeful action to improve our lives and the lives of those around us. When we have these opportunities to investigate what we deem as important, whether it's sustainable energy, climate change, or human rights violations, we have the ability to unpack why these issues exist and come up with solutions to make the world better. And as a result, we can empower ourselves as catalysts to the change that we wish to see. And yet, with all this evidence, we still have a long way to go to truly build the global learning spaces where all learners, and in fact the world, benefit from these important outcomes. And it's symposiums like this that bring critical perspectives together, including our keynote speaker tonight, that serves as a catalyst for all of us. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce our speaker. It's such an honor to have such a celebrated scholar with us this evening. Dr. Achebe is the Jack and Margaret Sweet Endowed Professor of History and multi-award-winning historian at Michigan State University. Dr. Achebe received her master's and PhD from UCLA after studying theater at the University of Massachusetts. Her research interests involve the use of oral history in the study of women, gender, and sexuality in Nigeria. She has many, many accomplishments, and we won't have time to really list them all here this evening, but I'll just name a few. Some of her award-winning books include Farmers, Traders, Warriors, and Kings, Female Power and Authority in Northern Igbo Land, 1900 to 1960, The Female King of Colonial Nigeria, Achebe Agbabe, a full-length critical biography of the only female warrant chief and king in British Africa. She's a co-editor with Claire Robertson of Holding the World Together, African Women in Changing Perspective, and she has a forthcoming book from Ohio University Press, Female Monarchs and Merchant Queens in Africa. Quite an impressive list. She's the founding editor-in-chief of the Journal of West African History, and she serves as a Ford Foundation and Hayes Fulbright Scholar in Residence at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka. Dr. Achebe has received prestigious grants from the Rockefeller Foundation, Werner Gren, Woodrow Wilson, Fulbright Hayes, Ford Foundation, World Health Organization, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Dr. Achebe.
Good evening, and thank you so very much for that warm welcome. Well, I feel deeply honored and privileged to have been asked to deliver the keynote address for this 2019 College of Arts and Sciences Alumni Chair in Humanities Symposium, Global Voices on the University of Dayton campus. I wish to thank Professor Julia Zamin, the Alumni Chair of the Humanities, for inviting me, and I would also like to thank Heidi Haas for making all of the arrangements. As I contemplate the challenge before me, I have decided to approach it from a very personal space, to speak to with the aim of making sense of my journey into awareness, African awareness, an awareness that materialized out of my desire to decolonize knowledge on and about Africa and African women, and how I have transmitted that awareness into my teaching about global Africa on 2 American college campuses, the College of William and Mary, and now Michigan State University. It is an awareness that developed and found expression at another American college campus, namely the University of California, Los Angeles, the institution from which I earned my master's and PhD degrees. Thus, I have necessarily tweaked the title of this presentation to make sense of my journey to that awareness. The slightly amended title now reads, Making Sense of Global Awareness on American College Campuses, Women's History in the African Tradition. The Yoruba of southwestern Nigeria have a fable that speaks to the importance of the journey. Akarugun was a hunter who had to journey into the forest of 1,000 spirits in search of a keg of knowledge. To get to the keg, Akarugun had to overcome insurmountable obstacles. He wrestled with dangerous spirits, some with 2 heads and 8 legs, others with eyes in the front and the back of their heads, and still others with heads of burning bushes. Each of these spirits had a test for Akarugun. Failure was not an option. He used his power of oratory to convince the spirits with a burning bush. He used his prowess as a wrestler to overcome the spirits with 2 heads and 8 legs. He used his singing and dancing to charm the spirits with eyes in front and in the back of their heads. Akarugun eventually reached his destination only to discover that the keg of knowledge that he was in search of was a mirage. He discovered that the journey itself, his process of discovery, was the real knowledge that he was after. As an African-born women's and gender historian, I too have come to the realization that the received knowledge about African women on American college campuses is a little more than a mirage. Like Akarugun, my personal journey of uncovering and unearthing African women's lives has been a trek through a forest of 1,000 spirits, a trek that has propelled me to decolonize and counter the narrative of received canon on my American college, in my American college classroom. It is a journey that I share with you now. In an essay, The African Woman Today, Ghanaian author Ama Taido laments, quote, the sorry pass that the daughters of the African continent have come to. Hear her words. It might not be fair to blame as well-intentioned an event as Bob Geldof's Band-Aid, which was staged to raise awareness of the plight of drought victims in Ethiopia, and even raise funds for them. But there is no doubt that ever since, the image of the African woman in the mind of the world has been set. She is breeding too many children that she cannot take care of, and for whom she should not expect other people to pick up the tab. She is hungry, and so are her children. In fact, it has become cliché of Western photojournalism that the African woman is old beyond her years. She is half naked. Her drooped and weathered breasts are well exposed. There are flies buzzing around the faces of her children, and she has a permanent begging bowl in her hand, end quote. Yes, indeed, the image of the African woman has been set. It is an image that I am confronted with each and every time I walk into my American African history classroom. Permit me then to spend a little time unpacking this Western construction of African images, a construction that did not merely suddenly come into being, but one which has, like the handshake in that perceptive Igbo proverb that extends beyond the elbow, resulted in something else. As a history professor at Michigan State University, I have found it necessary to begin each new African history class with an assessment of my students' knowledge about Africa. To this end, I have begun each semester by asking the following question. Tell me what comes to mind when you think about Africa. And as many times as I have asked this question, the response is always the same. The class quietens down, the students focus on anything in the classroom but me. This dodging of glances invariably continues until I assure my students that my question comes without judgment, that all that I am after is an uncensored list of the images that come to mind when they think about Africa. In other words, everyone thinks something about Africa. I have found that no sooner do I elucidate my intentions that answers start pouring out, sometimes faster than I'm able to list them on my PowerPoint. I do not think that it is necessary to rehash the exact images that my students have shared with me here, but suffice it to say that the vast majority of these images have in fact been negative. It is this exercise that propelled me to create what I call my African Studies Stop Word List, which is in essence a list of words or constructions that stop meaningful conversation and respectful engagement with Africa. In an important study, The Africa That Never Was, 4 Centuries of British Writing on Africa, Dorothy Hammond and Atlo Jablo tackled this issue of images. They conclude in the last paragraph of their book that, quote, 4 centuries of British writing on Africa has produced a literature which does not describe Africa, but in actuality describes British response to Africa, end quote. The authors further contend that, and I quote again, the image of Africa remains one of negative reflection, the shadow of the British self-image, end quote. A similar argument could be made about the visual images that have emerged and are consumed about Africa on American college campuses. Before the era of the Atlantic slave trade, a trade that has been described as the greatest forced migration in human history, the relationship between the West and Africa was one of respect, a relationship that celebrated the racial differences between Africans and Europeans, while at the same time purporting them as equal. Hence, Basil Davison's contention that during this early period, that there was a feeling in Europe that Africans were different yet equal. After all, it was during this period, specifically in 1325, that King Mansa Musa of Mali, after having returned from his famous pilgrimage to Mecca, a pilgrimage that had the effect of not only devaluating currency in Africa, but as far north of as Europe, put the kingdom on the international map. In this map, a black man, quite obviously a king, was depicted sitting on a throne and surrounded by numerous weights of gold. And let us not forget that memorable story of King Dom Afonso, who before the Atlantic slave trade had virtually consumed and depopulated his Congo kingdom, had forged a friendship with the King of Portugal. A friendship in which the royal brothers of Portugal and Congo were writing letters to each other that were couched in terms of complete equality of status. History informs us that emissaries went back and forth between them, thus establishing relationships between the Mbanza and the Vatican. And so strong was this relationship that a son of the Maui Congo was actually appointed as a bishop of his country in Rome. Now, even the sketchiest telling of this history reads like a fairy tale, not because it did not happen, but because we on American college campuses have become so accustomed and familiar with the Africa of Conrad's Heart of Darkness, a tradition which invented an Africa where nothing good happens or has ever happened, an Africa that has not yet been discovered and is waiting for the first European visitor to explore it and to explain it to itself. And explore it and explain it they did. The end product of this mapping, as well as this civilizing mission, were images of Africa that Africans themselves found strange. Take, for instance, the 18th century portrait of Francis Williams, an exceptional African who had graduated from Cambridge University. Francis Williams was a mathematician and would become a poet and founder of a school in Jamaica. The portrait of him by an anonymous artist showed him with a big flat face, lacking any distinctiveness, standing in a clotted library on tiny legs, which looked like broomsticks. The portrait was clearly an exercise in mockery. Perhaps Francis Williams aroused resentment because of his accomplishments, because it was clear that the anonymous caricature was intended to put him in his place. Or perhaps we should consider for a moment the plight of that poor Khoi woman, Sarah Bartman, aka the Hottentot Venus, who a couple of decades after Williams was sold to a European visiting Cape Town in 1810, taken to Europe and put on display in England and France as a freak show. She too would be subjected to portraits which dehumanized her by depicting in the most grotesque and exaggerated way her protruding backside. The spectacle of Bartman's body continued even after her death at age 26. Pseudoscientists interested in investigating primitive sexuality dissected and cast her genitals in wax. Now let us fast forward to the early 1990s and my graduate student days at UCLA, where I too was bombarded by negative images of Africans, this time in the form of the written text. It was these images, these skewed representations and interpretations of Africa and its peoples that led me on my journey of helping to propel and shape global awareness about Africa on American college campuses. It was these same images that encouraged me to paint a counter-narrative of another Africa on American college campuses and to become the African historian that I am today. I especially remember being forced to engage with Margaret Kinsman's Journal of South African History article entitled Beast of Burden, the Subordination of Southern Swanan Women. I have vivid memories of sitting in class and working to subdue my annoyance while at the same time trying to figure out for myself who exactly these beasts of burden, these African women who were sold to the highest bidder for their productive and reproductive labors were. Several years later, Catherine Karkovich adopted the same disparaging clause, beast of burden, to describe African women in her African Woman, A Modern History, and further denounced them as having, quote, a negative image of themselves. An image which was, quote, the result of society's refusal to recognize them as individuals, an entire existence devoted to domestic economy and training from their earliest years in humility and acceptance as norm of an ideology that was entirely based on labor, end quote. Again, I ask, whose African women are these? Because Kinsman's and Karkovic's African women most certainly did not represent me, nor any African women that I knew, for that matter. However, to cast blame solely on these authors would be to miss the point, because these imaginings of African women as beasts of burden, legal minors, overtly sexual beings, and the numerous derivatives of the aforementioned constructions are ubiquitous in the consciousness of American college students. Images such as the following. But are these images representative? Surely there was more, something missing. So let us for a moment turn to history to help solve this conundrum. African women have been known to occupy a variety of leadership positions in their societies. In ancient Egypt, Hatshepsut ruled as pharaoh. Tai and Nefertiti ruled as queens. The Lavadu rain queens controlled fertility of the crops. The Amazons of Dahomey served as a special corpus of trained palace guards and a specialized army for their kingdom. In 1623, at the age of 41, Nzinga became the ruler of Ndongo, Angola. Like Hatshepsut before her, she forbade her subjects from calling her queen. She instead insisted on being called king and marched into battle dressed like a man. She fought the Portuguese all her life, suffering severe setbacks. Even though Nzinga failed in her mission to expel the Portuguese, her historic importance transcends this failure, as she awakened and encouraged the first known stirrings of nationalism in West Central Africa. Other African queens were equally known for their warrior instincts, including the Luna queen, Nyarolo of Angola, who during her reign instituted a system of female chiefdoms in all of the countries that she conquered, and Queen Amina of Hausaland, a West African warrior woman who is said to have created the great Hausa Empire, but also led into battle a fierce army of horsemen. Indeed, so powerful is the memory of her exploits that songs of her deeds are still being sung today. We cannot also forget Mbuya, grandmother Nahanda, the female incarnation of the royal Shona Mohandoro, or lion spirit, Nahanda. Mboyo Nahanda II would emerge 500 years after her forebear's death as a suitable medium to lead the first Chimurenga, or War of Liberation, of 1896 to 1897. She was captured in December 1897 and went to her death in defiance, denouncing the British. Her dying words, "My bones will rise again," predicted the second Chimurenga, which culminated in the independence of present-day Zimbabwe. Around the same time, Ya Asantewa, the Asante Hema, or Queen Mother of the Jusi, Asanteland, will nurture the same smoking flame. The year was 1899, and the British had just exiled King Perempe II 2 years earlier, and in an attempt to further humiliate them, had sent the British governor to Kumasi to demand the golden stool, a symbol of Asante unity. In the face of this insult, even the bravest male members of the nation were cowed. In her now famous challenge, Ya Asantewa declared, and I quote, "How can a proud and brave people like the Asante sit back and look while white men took away their king and chiefs, and humiliate them with a demand for the golden stool. The golden stool only means money to the white man. They searched and dug everywhere for it. If you, the chiefs of Asante, are going to behave like cowards and not fight, you should exchange your loincloths for my undergarments, end quote. That was the beginning of the Ya Asantewa War, which would eventually lead to her capture and deportation to the Seychelles Islands, but would, like the fine example shown by her foremothers before her, revive the spirit of pride and resistance among the Asante. Having touched on African warrior women, let me now briefly say a word or two about other expressions of female power and authority in African societies. In some societies, a system of joint sovereignty existed, whereby leadership responsibilities were shared between a king and a female counterpart. In these systems, women held power because of their relationship to the ruler in question, especially as mother, daughter, or sister. The mother of the Fawn, the male ruler of the kingdom of Kom in western Cameroon, advised him and watched over the children of the palace. In the Mossi kingdom, the eldest daughter of the Mossi king dressed in the king's attire and held royal power until the next ruler was installed. Among the Yoruba of southwestern Nigeria, the Iyoba queen mother, the Olorin, the head wife of the king, the Iyalode, the ceremonial minister of social affairs, all held significant political power, exerting considerable influence over men's offices while participating actively in policy making and traditional government. Some small-scale African societies had a dual-sex system in which each sex managed its own affairs. Among the non-central equal, a joint system of male and female government obtained. In this system of government, the Umwada, daughters of the lineage, and the Inyondi, wives of the lineage, emerged as the supreme political bodies, with the Otumwada featuring as the Supreme Court of arbitration. There was no male Supreme Court in Igbo land, only women had a Supreme Court. The question that now arises is, if all of the above is true about African women, where then does the ever-present image of African women as subservient, a beast of burden, legal minor, and oversexed on American college campuses come from? I suggest, much like Hammond and Jablow before me, that downtrodden, subordinate, and oversexed African woman is very much a figment of Western imagination, a lark that allowed them to construct an African woman that never was and never would be. For were the truth be known, most of these early authors would have had very little meaningful contact with African women, and hence little first-hand knowledge of them. However, this fact did not prevent them from crafting stories of her toils in numerous pieces of fiction and nonfiction, stories that have survived and thus shaped how African women are imagined and constructed in the present day on American college campuses. The following passage from Stuart Clote's 1955 best-selling travel log, The African Giant, the story of a journey, demonstrates this obsession. And I'm going to read briefly. One is suddenly aware of the immense sexuality of the African woman. Many of them were beautiful once you became used to African beauty. One could see why white men took them as housekeepers. They were all women. They were, in a sense, without souls. They were bold and without innocence. They said with their dark eyes, "We are women. You are a man. You know what you want." End quote. Listen now to a similar passage, this time from Joyce Carey's novel, Mr. Johnson. The girls and women know that speech is none of their business. They will do what they are told. They fix their sleepy eyes on the speaker and allow their usual train of feelings to continue. Now, this assumption of the African woman as nothing but a dirge, completely subjugated, if not actually enslaved, is reinforced by superficial knowledge of African cultural and social institutions, such as bride price, polygamy, and more recently, female circumcision. Allow me a moment to address some of these misconceptions. So first, African bride price. The true significance of bride price, bride wealth, or bride service is well described by Edwin W. Smith and Andrew Dale in their ethnography of the Bala of northern Zimbabwe. Their description could apply to almost any African group in which the custom obtains. Hear their words. The goods given by or on behalf of the bridegroom to the parents of the bride are called chiko. To us, it may seem to be a matter of buying and selling, but the Bala would repudiate any such ideal. The woman is not bought. Her husband does not acquire proprietary rights over her. The chiko is more properly regarded as compensation to the girl's clan, a return to the parents and guardians for the expense they have incurred in her rearing, the seal of that contract by which she is to become the mother of the man's children, and a guarantee of good treatment. In fact, among the Igbo of eastern Nigeria, bride price simply guarantees the bridegroom rights over his soon-to-be-born children, so that those children can bear his name and belong to his lineage rather than their mother's. With regards to polygamy, I would like to say but three things. First, polygamy is not, and I repeat, not, the most common form of marriage in Africa. In fact, only very few Africans are polygamous, because only very few Africans can afford to be polygamous. Second, there are many other types of polygamy in Africa. In some African nations, particularly among the people of the plateau regions of Nigeria, as well as some small pockets of the Sudan, Benin Republic, Congo, Angola, Mozambique, Tanzania, and Kenya, women marry many husbands in an institution known as polyandry. Also, African women have been known to marry other women. These relationships, which are not lesbian in nature, afford the African female husband the opportunity to marry a wife and in essence assume the gendered role, social role of husband and father. All children born of these unions belong to the female husband and bear her name. I have but a few words to say about female circumcision, or sometimes it's called genital mutilation, genital cutting, and all of its derivatives. Ever since Alice Walker dedicated her book, Possessing the Secret of Joy, with tenderness and respect to the blameless African vulva, end quote, and in the same breath, strong-armed Africans into accepting what she, someone who, quote, loves her former home, is saying, the discourse on female circumcision has been reframed and remapped along imperialist and colonial discourses. Western feminists have been given the license and authority to practice the very silencing and stigmatization of women that feminism challenges. And this silencing has been framed around debates over human rights. No one has thought to question the politics of one part of the world, the so-called First World, nonetheless, defining human rights for the rest of the so-called Third or Developing world. I suggest, much like Sandra Hale, American anthropologist of the Sudan, that this feminist-led insurgency against female circumcision in Africa actually has more to do with the Western feminists themselves and less to do with the African women they seem so impatient to save. It concerns an eagerness to erect the we versus them hierarchy that objectifies and inferiorizes African women. Hear Sandra Hale's words. She says, "We may also ask ourselves why so many Westerners, especially, but not only white feminists, are becoming active in either scholarship or politics around this issue without knowing anything about the practices or without having had a single conversation with a circumcised woman. In this sense, and in others, we seem to have engaged in a great deal of arrogant perception, which really relates not so much to what we think of something, but what we do with that information, and especially how we use our analyses to set ourselves apart," end quote. It would appear that ethnocentrism and Eurocentrism in present-day scholarship has come full cycle 40 years after Hammond and Jablow's revelations in the Africa Networks. We must remember that this type of armchair activism is a form of invasion, perceiving as it does the oppressed as helpless victims, proxies, who are totally devoid of the agency required to change their oppressive reality. So we have thus dedicated our time to considering episodes of female power in the human visible realm, that is discussing African women's leaders in their various societies and confronting the misconceptions that stop the conversation. But by focusing exclusively on the human realm, we only paint one part of the African women's narrative. We leave untouched that which is by far the most superior expression of female power in Africa, the female principle in the spiritual non-visible realm. Painting the total narrative, or put differently, viewing the masquerade dance from all perspectives, is where my own work on and teaching about African women and gender makes its most valuable contribution. And what, may you ask, am I talking about? What is the spiritual realm? The answer is simple. The African world operates within a cyclical movement of time. African peoples therefore identify two worlds, the human, physical, visible world, and the non-human, spiritually visible world. These worlds are not separate, but like two half circles or two halves of a coconut, when connected, make one continuous, one complete, one whole African world. Therefore, in politics, for instance, African peoples identify two political systems, the human, which we have already talked about, and the spiritual. The spiritual political consistency is made up of spiritual divinities, as well as male and female functionaries who derive their political power from an association with the spiritual world. A higher form of government, these medicines, goddesses, priestesses, and diviners figure as political heads of their communities. Hence, C.K. Meek's assertion that the gods and goddesses are the true rulers of African towns, and human beings are merely there to interpret the will of the gods. The female mass spirits of West Africa, for instance, feature prominently as judicial courts and judges of moral conduct. One such mass spirit, Abere, operated as an integral part of the legal system and actively functioned as an agent of social control. She had the power and authority to order humans without challenge, and her decrees and punishments were uncontestable. Now, as far back as the 1800s, Nyamwezi women engendered an unusual degree of authority in ritual situations. In the kingdoms of Bonyoro, Buganda, and Buhai, Unyamwezi, and Usukuma, spirit societies were centered on groups of legendary heroes known as Swazi or Mwanda. The Swazi were the names of the early rulers of the western Uganda. As the Swazi kingdom declined, the people began to honor the spirits of their former kings. In these hierarchical societies, women's positions depended on their status in the class system. Few upper-class women attained considerable wealth and authority. Spirit mediumship societies thus provided women with the greatest avenues for active participation in politics and religious life. Spirit mediums were separated from society by the special regalia that they wore. They had a secret vocabulary and possessed esoteric knowledge. Most importantly, they possessed legal immunity. They were concerned, like their Igbo counterparts, mainly with female activities such as fertility and agriculture. My talk has thus far attempted to paint a counter-narrative to received canon on African women's pre-colonial political and religious roles on American college campuses. I unfortunately do not have time to speak about the disadvantaged political and religious position that most African women found themselves during the colonial era. Yet, in many ways, my award-winning book, The Female King of Colonial Nigeria, does not rest satisfied with simple answers. It instead methodologically complicates the received canon about African women's disadvantaged position during the colonial period by situating the life story of one woman who not only was not disadvantaged, but managed to rise to unforeseen heights as a result of her collaboration with the British colonialists. So, allow me now to end my narrative about making sense of global Africa awareness on American college campuses by briefly exploring African women's presence in two important areas of endeavor today. First, politics. The 1980s and 1990s ushered in an era of renewed political zeal among women across Africa. Women in as many as 5 African countries, Tanzania, Angola, Central African Republic, Guinea-Bissau, and Nigeria, placed ballots to become presidential candidates. Between 1994 and 2003, Uganda's Dr. Wandira Kanzimbwe served as vice president. A year later, in 2004, Mozambican Luiza Diogo became the first African woman head of government. She would serve as prime minister until January 2010. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf followed suit, becoming the first female president of Liberia in January 2006. Africa's second female president, Joyce Hilda Banda of Malawi, was sworn in on April 7, 2012. Africa's third female president is Amina Gorib. A biodiversity scientist by training, She served as the 6th president of Mauritius from 2015 to 2018. African women also made gains in other arenas of national politics, with women averaging 23.7% of parliamentary seats in sub-Saharan Africa. 25 African countries rank in the top 100 for women representation worldwide in their national legislatures or parliaments. With 61.3% of the parliamentary seats, Rwandan women rank #1 in the world for female representation, 61.3%. With 42.1% of its parliamentary seats, South Africa ranks 7th in the world. With between 41.8 and 31% representation, Senegal, Namibia, Mozambique, Ethiopia, Tanzania, Burundi, Uganda, Zimbabwe, Tunisia, and Cameroon rank in the top 43. With between 30.5 and 20% representation, Angola, Sudan, South Sudan, Algeria, Mauritania, Somalia, Lesotho, Eritrea, Guinea, Kenya, Seychelles, Morocco, and Equatorial Guinea all place in the top 99. In comparison, the United States ranks #100 of women representation with 19.4% of total members. So how are African women faring in the economic realm of their societies today? According to a 2018 report of the MasterCard Index of Women Entrepreneurship, Africa has the highest growth rate of women entrepreneurs. Moreover, African women entrepreneurs have fared better than their European counterparts. For example, in Switzerland, 1 out of every 4 companies is owned by women, whereas in Ghana, women own half of the companies. In fact, Ghana has the highest percentage of women business owners worldwide. And Uganda comes in 3rd overall. So who are these business women that I'm talking about? And I'm going to talk about some of the wealthiest business women in Africa. So with an estimated net worth of $3.3 billion, Angolan investor and businesswoman Isabel dos Santos is Africa's richest woman and one of the continent's most powerful businesswomen. Dos Santos accumulated her wealth in oil, diamonds, communications, and banking. Nigeria's fallen Shah Alikaja is Africa's 2nd richest woman. She serves as vice chair of Fanfan Oil, a Nigerian oil exploration company with an abundant offshore field. South African-born Simbongoli Sambo is the founder and managing director of SRS Aviation, the first Black female-owned aviation company in South Africa. Another South African businesswoman, Brigitte Radebe, is Africa's first Black female mining entrepreneur and president of her country's largest mining chamber, the South African Mining Development Association. The 51-year-old Kenyan Tabitha Karanja is founding CEO of Karosha's Breweries, the only large-scale brewery in Kenya owned by a Kenyan. And last but not least, in 2004, Bethlehem Alimu founded Soul Rebels, an eco-friendly footwear company. The company has grown to become one of the largest footwear companies in Africa, with flagship stores around the globe in countries like Taiwan, Spain, Switzerland, Austria, the United States, Singapore, and Japan. Alimo has been named Forbes magazine 20 youngest power women in Africa, as well as one of the world's 100 most powerful women. My people, the Igbo, have a saying that a friend is like a water source for a long journey. I embarked on this journey of making sense of global African womanhood on American college campuses among friends. So permit me, my friends, to leave you with another fable, this time from the Akan people of Ghana, that speaks to the importance of sharing knowledge. A long time ago, Anansi, the spider, had all the knowledge in the world stored in a huge pot. Nyame, the sky god, had given it to him and had instructed him to share it with everyone. Every day, Anansi looked in the pot and learned different things. The pot was full of wonderful ideas and skills. Anansi greedily thought, I will not share the treasure of knowledge with anyone. I will keep it all to myself. So Anansi decided to hide the knowledge on top of a tall tree. He took some vines, made a strong string, and tied it firmly around the pot. He then tied the other end around his waist so that the pot hung in front of him. He started to climb the tree. He struggled because the pot of wisdom kept getting in his way. Anansi's son watched in fascination as his father struggled up the tree. Finally, he called out to his father, if you tie the pot to your back, it will be easier to cling to the tree and climb. Anansi tied the pot to his back and continued to climb the tree, this time with much more ease than before. When Anansi got to the top of the tree, he became angry. A young one with some common sense knows more than I who has the pot of knowledge. In anger, Anansi threw down the pot. It broke, and pieces of knowledge flew in every direction. People found bits of it scattered everywhere. And if they wanted to, they could take some of it home to their families and friends. That is why, to this day, no one person has all the world's knowledge. People everywhere share small bits of it wherever they exchange ideas.
So we have time for a few questions. Questions? We have microphone down there.
Thank you so much for that very inspiring talk.
Turn it on.
Particularly enthused by the statement regarding Rwanda. As we all might know, Rwanda has really turned around in recent years in terms of economic vitality. So your comment about the percentage of women being very active in the economic development of Rwanda is very appealing to me. So can you share more light on that in terms of lessons for other African countries? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think Rwanda has really shown us an example of what we should aspire to be in Africa. you know, I stand here originally from Nigeria, and I'm sad to say that Nigeria does not make this list at all. We haven't done what we need to do. And if you look at our pre-colonial reality, you see how centrally women, African women, featured in day-to-day running of society. If anything, it is colonialism that set African women back, because a lot of the colonial powers removed women from the position of power that African women were so used to and accustomed to filling, and pushed us to the back. But what Rwanda has done, which becomes not only an example for Africa, but for the entire world, Rwanda is able to show us how to accomplish this gender. It's even more than gender priority. It's 61 point something percent, 0.3%. And so yes, Rwanda is one country that I say to my students, we've got to look to and emulate. And a lot of it has to do with coming out of the genocide, right? And the government being very intentional about being inclusive, right? About being, you know, this whole idea of diversity and inclusion and championing it. And like I said, the rest of Africa has a lot to learn from the Rwandan example. The rest of the world has a lot to learn about, you know, from the Rwanda example, about best practices. This is the way to do it.
Thank you so much.
Good evening, and thank you for your presentation. It was brilliant. So I'm from South Africa, and one of the things that I value is that we have on the books that women are being supported in business. But somehow, sometimes we distort the reality of that. So I might be put forward as the owner of the business, while my husband or whoever else takes care of it. Even with that said, it does open the door, because there are women who are doing fabulous things in business. And I'm just wondering what the best practices are that you've seen in terms of providing women with training and development opportunities that we could take and try to engage.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that question. Again, because I'm a historian, I like to always go back to history and see from whence the rain began to beat us, according to my people, right? And when you look at pre-colonial African history, those concerns that you are addressing were concerns that we had in the pre-colonial era. If you look at South African women owned businesses. They made beer, they did all sorts of things, right? So a lot of what we're really trying to, at this point, regain a semblance, just a semblance of our past reality. That's what we're trying to do. You know, we are suffering from the, what is it called, era of colonialism. How do we do it, right? I think that if the answer to that were easy, I think that a lot of us would be doing it, and you're right. I mean, in this last section, I purposefully sort of gave examples of women that are at really the top echelon of business. But you know what? African women, overwhelmingly, in terms of Africa in general, are majority owners of small businesses. Of small business, not the big ones, the small businesses. You know, in West Africa, we call these businesses, some of them, these mama put, these small restaurants, and, you see them, but they're doing it for themselves, right? And we know that African women are doing that. So really, when you say, what are best practices, as a historian, I would say we need to go back and learn from the past. In the past, I like to say to my students, there is no such thing as an African woman that did not work. There is no such thing as a stay-at-home mom. And I preface that by saying, listen, I'm a mother. I'm not standing here to say that motherhood is not a difficult job. It is. But all African women worked. This is hence some of these misconceptions about African women. When African women will carry their babies on their back and go to the farm, 70% of African women are farmers, right? We were told that we're beasts of burden because African women are carrying their babies on their backs and going to farm. Now, medical science tells us that that body-to-body contact is extremely important for babies. Hence, now you see in the West, people swaddling their baby. We African women have been doing it from time immemorial, but we were called beasts of burden. And when we strap our kids on our back, when you're farming, you take the hoe and you're doing this. This movement, this motion rocks your child to sleep. You know, so there is a lot to learn from what it is that we did pre-colonially. Pre-colonially, we had these traditional banking systems. Women were in charge of banking systems. In my culture, it was called a susu. Among the Cameroon, can you remind me? Jangi. One of my really good friends, Bridget Tero, who's professor of history at UMass Dartmouth, is part of an Njangi, a Cameroonian Njangi in this country. She was telling me how, she said, you know what, I want to redo my bathroom, and you all know how expensive bathrooms are. So she got a loan, no interest loan from her Njangi to do it. No interest, right? So these systems are important. We had them pre-colonially. If we still have them now, women can still tap into those resources and create these small businesses as well.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. You had referred, while you were talking, to this kind of highly instrumentalized discourse of human rights, sort of we see almost constantly deployed. So as a historian, I just wanted to ask how you yourself make sense of that. And it might be a bit of one and a bit of the other, but it seems like the two ways we might think of that. On the one hand, we can attribute it to ignorance or lack of consciousness about more complex sort of historical structures you're mentioning. The obvious sort of other way to think about it would be as some kind of thin rationalization for other kinds of material or other kinds of strategic interests. So how do you make sense of that, both as a historian and then I guess also in terms of explaining, do a talk like the one you just did, how do you sort of communicate, I guess, in a historically sensitive enough way or nuanced enough way, how we're then supposed to be left thinking about how human rights discourse is deployed? Yeah.
That's a hard one. It's a good question, but a hard one. And I talked about that in relation to female circumcision and that entire controversy, right, in Africa. I typically, let me just say this first, I typically in my classroom don't teach about female circumcision in Africa. It's just something I don't do. The only time I bring it up is in my PhD level seminars, African history seminars, because I believe that my students at that point have enough background to sort of tackle this issue. And we don't talk about female circumcision itself. We talk about female circumcision and the politics of knowledge, which is where I'm coming from. And so if you take an institution such as that, my feeling is that when it comes to certain institutions in Africa, the reason that I, an African woman, don't teach about it, typically don't talk about it, is because I am a firm believer that when it comes to women's issues in Africa and the feminist agenda, that we must allow African women to define our own feminist agenda, right? There is no such thing as a universality of the women's experience. It's just non-existent. So that, you know, over here, women are taking back the night. Women are fighting to earn more as much as men. We still earn, what, 70, 80 cents to the dollar. African women don't have that fight. That doesn't mean that everything is hunky-dory in Africa, but it's just not our fight. Because in pretty much all African countries that I know, women earn the same. It's not like 70 or 80%, so that's not our fight. Now, what is our fight? When you ask African women, they will tell you things that don't necessarily seem like a women's right or feminist agenda. Some of the things that materialize as top of our list would be things like, I hear African women talking about, there's no running water in my community, or the government has raised school fees. That becomes an African woman's feminist agenda. Because, like I said, African women work. And they're the ones that are paying for, their kids' education and all of that kind of stuff. So it becomes an agenda item. Female circumcision is not tops on the African women's agenda. And even when it features, the way it features is not the way that it's being articulated in the West. People are not talking, for instance, about a lot of the gains that African women themselves have made on the African continent. People are not talking, for instance, about this institution of a circumcision of words that you have in present-day Kenya, where they recognize that it is very difficult to do away with an institution that has been there from time immemorial, an institution that really sort of symbolizes the maturity of a girl into an adult. You have to replace it with something. What are they replacing it with? They're now replacing it with words, teaching Kenyan Kikuyu women what it means to be a woman in the absence of the ritual, right? So this is my roundabout way of saying that with certain, quote unquote, issues that we might define as human rights on this part of the lake, they're not necessarily defined in that way in Africa. And so for me, as an African feminist, what I say to my Western counterparts is that if you want to be part of the solution, your role is to listen to African women, not lead the charge. You must listen, you must truly hear African women, and be involved when you are invited to be involved. African women don't need Western women taking over their fight, because that's what happens a lot of times when everyone is at the table, is that all of a sudden African women are silenced and somebody else is speaking for them. Okay. So I don't know, I know it was sort of like a roundabout way of answering that, but for me, when it comes to Africa, I say that Africans should be allowed to define for the world what their fight is, what their human rights fight is, what their other fights are. And if we on the other side of the world want to participate or help, we need to listen, because not all help is good help. And I don't know if the college students here, University of Dayton, did it, but a few years ago at my university, Michigan State University, a lot of the students were collecting slippers for African people. And you saw them walking barefoot on campus because they were collecting this to send to African, I'm assuming other parts of the so-called developing world. Now, that's a good intention, but not all good intentions are good. And this is what I say to my students, because what did that do? You shipload these slippers to Africa. What does that do? It displaces African women, who are the market women that sell handmade slippers, which are much more expensive than these second-hand cheap slippers. And so in attempting to do good, you've actually not done so good. You've actually done bad with regards to this African woman that's losing business. Because she now is forced to compete with these cheap items that have flooded, secondhand items that have flooded the marketplace. And so, yeah, so my starting point when it comes to human rights or anything, especially with regards to Africa, is let us be sensitive to what African people are saying. Whether it's African women or African, let's be sensitive to what they're saying. Let us listen, and then if we want to, let us ask how it is that they want us to participate in this movement, and let them take the lead.
So okay, after you go the last, do you have a student? Okay, no, go ahead. We're all students of law, right?
Well, thank you for your talk. I have one question. When you're dealing with or trying to undermine the myths and stereotypes about Africa in your classroom,
Yes.
do you find that there's a tension, perhaps in some way, when you're teaching as you go through the semester, to try to mythologize African history, to avoid the contradictions? Because by wading into the torture chamber of these contradictions, you then actually will basically, reinforce stereotypes. And I thought you kind of touched on that with the FTC, issue as well. So.
Yeah, thank you, that's a good question. I start all of my African history classes with an Igbo proverb that says that you cannot appreciate the masquerade dance by standing in one position. A spectator cannot appreciate the beauty of the masquerade dance by standing in one position. That simply means that there are many ways of seeing the world. There are many perspectives and points of view and different ways of seeing. And so what I say to my students is that as a professor of African history, my charge is very simple in the American college classroom. It's a very, very simple charge that I have. And it is, if by the end of the semester, I can convince my American students that Africans, not to other Africans, or to think about Africans as that dark continent where things that they don't understand happen, then my job has been done. So all I'm trying to do is make my students realize that Africans, with all of their imperfections, are more like them than they would ordinarily imagine. And so for me, I practically go through 4 weeks, the first 4 weeks of my class is all about images. We read articles on perception, point of view, different ways of seeing, mindset. We read articles on historiography, all of that stuff. And I came about that. We do activities that are designed to expose bias, perception, point of view, all of that, because I came by that having taught my first African history class at UCLA. And at the end of a 10-week semester, students were still talking about Africa using my stop words that I know that I didn't use to define Africa. And so they were not ready to listen to me or to hear me. And so what I do in that first 4 weeks is really, we go through images of Africa. Where do they come from? Why is it that when you think about Africa, you think a certain thing? For me, it is about balance. Where one thing stands, something else will stand beside it. So what I try and do in my class is really sort of introduce, I call it, my students always, they always laugh, but I call it another Africa. It is the Africa that they're not used to seeing. It is the Africa that I know. I don't know how to teach Africa other than the way that I teach it, which is from an insider's perspective, because I am African. I don't know how else to view Africa. And so the way I teach Africa is from an African-centered perspective. First thing I say to my students, I will never ask you what dates anything happened. And they all clap. Because that is not the way that Africans conceptualize time. We don't talk about dates. If you go to the rural area and go to an old man or woman and say, mother, father, sign of respect, how old are you? They're going to tell you they're 150 years old. Are they 150? Of course not. They just don't know how old they are. Or they will tell you, but you know that there weren't any dates when I was born. You haven't asked the right question, and this is what I teach my African students. You go into the African rural area, you ask, what is it called, an African-centered question. You ask them, father and mother, what was happening around the time that you were born? For Africans, time is about periods of time. They will tell you, I was born in Igbo, Ogo Titopo. Ogo Titopo means, direct translation, during the time of the Great Destroyer. The Great Destroyer was the Great Influenza of 1918. And so I can then turn back and say, were you born then? Or how big were you? And they'll point to someone and say, I was that big. And then I can tell them, and then I call that person and say, how old are you? They'll say, Auntie, I'm 12 years old. I'll say, at 12 to 1918, and that's how old you are. And they're like, whoa. Or, in my father's time, my father's generation, they would talk about, I was born when daytime suddenly became nighttime. And we know that in Nigeria, daytime suddenly became nighttime twice. Once in 1935, and the second time in around 1942. So when they tell me I was born when daytime suddenly became nighttime, I'll say which one, the first or the second? And then they'll be like, our daughter, how did you know all of this stuff? Daytime becoming nighttime, what do I mean by that? When my dad was about 5 years old, they're all playing outside. All of a sudden, a swarm of locusts come in, and it blocks the sun. So daytime, they were playing in the daytime, and all of a sudden, it became nighttime. That happened twice in recent Nigerian history. So this is the way that we tell time. And I could go on and on and on. But that is what I try to impart to my students, is that when they walk into my class, all of a sudden they've walked into Africa. And so when I have students who say, can I call you Wanda? I'm like, no, forget that I have a first name. Because you've walked into my class, we're in Africa. And it's about African culture, it teaches respect. I said, you will call me Dr. Echebe or Professor Echebe. If you don't want to call me that, you call me Auntie Wanda. So I have some students who say, hi, Auntie Wanda. Hello. But that's what it is. You walk into my class, it's an African experience of culture, of history, of all of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Last question for Sir.
Listening to you, Dr. I was reminded of the fond story that your late dad used to tell about seeing the books that you came home with as a little girl that you were reading in school. And he was distressed about those
My
books.
sister, actually, my big sister. Yeah.
And he was distressed about the books, the Eurocentric books that you were reading. And he hadn't dabbled into telling children's stories at that time. And necessity made him the author of children's stories.
Yeah, which I benefited from.
Because I was wondering, as you were making your presentation, where this might have begun for you.
Yeah.
Because it sounds like at that early stage, if you were now beginning to read children's books by your own dad, that you could see yourself reflected.
Oh,
in.
yes.
Perhaps this journey, as you call it, began way back then as you were looking at two tensions.
Yes.
Speak to that. If you
My journey actually began, that was my sister, my big sister, who inspired my father to start writing children's stories. My own journey, so I was born in Nigeria, and I came to the US when I was 2 for the first time. I like to say that English is a learned language. Igbo is my mother tongue. My first words were in Igbo. My second word was in English, so I'm perfectly bilingual. But when we came to the U.S. when I was 2, my parents were essentially running away from Nigeria after the Nigerian-Biafran War. And they were in exile. And so finding a new place to live in Amherst, Massachusetts, I was sent to a daycare, which was called the Living and Learning School at about 2. And I remember not wanting to go to school because of the way that the kids were treating me. I was the only black kid in the entire school. Actually, there was another one, Janetta Cole, who was the first president of Spelman College. She's my Aunt Janetta. Her son, Che, was my best friend. And, you know, he was also in the school, but he did not look visibly black. He had straight hair, gray eyes, so they didn't know he was black until his mother showed up. And once she showed up, it was the 2 of us. They were just not treating us right. And so what did my young mind do? It gave up speech. I refused to speak the English language. The teachers called my parents in and said, "What the heck are you doing? This kid cannot speak English." And my parents said, "This kid can speak perfect English. If she's not speaking English, she's choosing not to." And so they observed. And it turned out that I was responding, everything that they said, I was responding to them in English. And it was because I did not like the way that they were treating me, thus I gave up the English. And that was my protest in terms of the way that they were treating me. But to get back to this whole idea of stories, the only way my father got me to go to school was to tell me a story. The deal was one story on the way to school and another on the way back. Otherwise, I told my parents, I'm not going. It's not happening. And so this whole idea of storytelling is something that my earliest memories are of my parents telling us, Amherst, Massachusetts, sitting in the basement, turn the lights off, light candles to simulate the African, moonlight. And my parents would tell us stories of Mbe, the tortoise, and we would sing. That is the memory that I have of my father. But he combined that with also telling us, reading to us. So it was the best of both worlds. It was the oral tradition, but it was also the bedtime stories. And I would not go to bed without a bedtime story. And so if we had guests or friends came to the house, that was one way that I could, say, I'm not going to bed, I'm going to stay up late because and it was my father who read to us. He's the one who tucked us into bed and read to us every single night. It was also my father who woke me up and took me to the bathroom, otherwise I would have wet the bed. And anytime my father traveled abroad or whatever, like clockwork, I wet the bed, because he was the one who came up with the bed, yes. I was a bedwetter now. I seriously was. I'm not even ashamed to admit it, yeah. But it, all sort of revolved around my dad. My dad was a storyteller. He read to us, and in the middle of the night, he would take me to the bathroom and bring me back. Yeah.
Okay. When I was telling Dr. Chebe today that I think 2 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, when I walked into a session at the African Study Association, and I heard her speak at a session which she had organized for one of her former professors at UCLA, I immediately said to myself that I will try to bring her to the University of Cambridge. And today, you see exactly why I made that decision. Yes. She lived up to that. We have a little token here. We don't want to, because she's fluid, so we don't want to make her look very heavy. So, but we have a couple of books, the faculty folks like books, right? So we have an autograph book from America's foremost author of Paul's Dump, Herb Martin. So Herb Martin, Professor Herb Martin, autographed a book for her. And we have another book in which the University of Dayton has been involved in study abroad immersion programs for many years. And they have told a lot of stories about their experiences. And so we have another autograph book on African emotion, authored by yours truly. Just something to remember us, right? You know, gadgets sometimes they do kind of die, the battery dies sometimes when we least expect. So we have a charger there. We are alumni, right? So, thank you.